In the spring of 2007, I was fortunate enough to attend the first Championship playoff final to be held at the new Wembley Stadium. Unfortunately, my beloved Hull City weren't present. We only stayed in the division by the skin of our teeth that season, and it would take another 12 months before I got that privilege. So instead, I was treated to a game between two teams separated by just 40 miles in the middle of England, namely Derby County and West Bromwich Albion. West Brom had only been relegated from the Premier League the previous season and were looking to mount an immediate return following a 5th place finish in the Championship. Derby had been playing outside of English football's top flight a little longer, 5 years, and had only missed out on automatic promotion to the Premier League by 2 points. If I'm honest with you, whilst I was still in awe at the size and impression that Wembley Stadium left on you, the game itself was far from a classic. As far as I can recall, it rained quite a lot, and there wasn't a great deal of goalmouth action. In the end, the game was won by a tap-in on the counter-attack from Stephen Pearson, with what was actually his first league goal for Derby County. The Rams were promoted in what was then known as the £60 million game of football, and their Premier League status was confirmed. The following season, Derby were relegated with the lowest ever points tally in what was, without any shadow of a doubt, the worst ever season in the history of the Premier League. Now, more than a decade on, Derby face a crisis not just on the pitch, but off it as well, as the club has gone to war with the English Football League, racked up vast debts, and has had a couple of bizarre failed takeover attempts, one involving a relative of the wealthiest owner in English football, and another involving a man with an even stranger and far more mysterious background, as well as a myriad of bizarre accusations and denials that could take up an entire video all of their own. They won't be able to though, because there is much more to this story than the identity of one failed wannabe owner, or supposed wannabe owner, but possible con artist, to the weird and not always quite so wonderful tale that is the last few years of madness at Derby County Football Club. I have been requested this one a lot, and I mean a lot, and it's 3 months since I last did a club-specific What on Earth is Going On video, which was all about Deportivo La Coruña. So settle down, strap in, and join me on a journey to the East Midlands of England, to the banks of the River Derwent, which weaves its way right past Pride Park, the home of Derby County, to the city in which Florence Nightingale was raised, the site of the world's first factory and one of the birthplaces of the Industrial Revolution, to the birthplace of Herbert Spencer, Alan Bates, and Gary Cahill, in a tale containing heroes, villains, and occasional question marks over who's who between the two. Derby County have been crowned as champions of English football more times than Leicester City, West Ham United, and, yes, as they often like to remind people, even their great East Midland rivals, Nottingham Forest. Derby's heyday came in the early to mid-1970s, initially under the partnership of Brian Clough and Peter Taylor, who took the club from 2nd Division strugglers all the way to 1st Division champions within the space of just 4 seasons. And Clough's successor and his former club captain at the baseball ground, Dave Mackay, added a second top-flight league title to the club's trophy cabinet just a couple of years after Clough's infamous and highly acrimonious departure. Founded in 1884, like so many clubs at the time, as an offshoot of the local cricket club, so players had something to keep them occupied during the winter months, Derby were inaugural members of the English Football League in 1888, and they became a competitive First Division outfit in 1891 when a 17-year-old wonder kid by the name of Steve Bloomer broke through at the club. Widely regarded as Derby's greatest ever player, and indeed one of England's greatest ever players, Bloomer dragged Derby to 3 FA Cup finals, but they lost all 3 with an aggregate scoreline of just 2 goals scored and 13 conceded. In the end, it would take until after Britain had fought in a couple of world wars for Derby to win their first FA Cup, and their first major trophy. That success finally arriving in the first post-war FA Cup final of 1946, when Derby defeated Charlton Athletic 4-1 during extra time in front of 98,000 spectators at the old Wembley Stadium. That was the only major trophy that Derby won prior to the arrival of Clough and Taylor in the late 1960s, and they have suffered from an even greater drought in the near half-century that has passed since the club won their last league championship in 1975. In fact, These days, much to their chagrin, Derby County are probably best known to most overseas and younger football fans for just one thing, and that is their extraordinarily bad 2007-08 season that I mentioned during the introduction. Derby won just 11 points all season, despite taking a somewhat amusing 4 points off Newcastle United alone. But whilst that may be your abiding or even your only memory of Derby County, in the case of some viewers, an awful lot has happened at the club since that catastrophic Premier League campaign some 13 years ago. Their pitiful 2007-08 season hadn't just seen turmoil on the pitch, with players effectively having given up from about November onwards, it also heralded a change in ownership. Millionaire property developer Peter Gadsby, a Derby fan who had acquired the club in 2006, sold the majority of his shares to Adam Pearson in October 2007, who also became the club's new chairman. Pearson had previously taken Hull City from the old 4th Division up to the Championship, but he didn't have the kind of funds to mount a promotion push in the Championship. So he arrived at Derby with the immediate intention of securing overseas investment. When Pearson arrived in October 2007, Derby still, seemingly, had a chance of surviving in the Premier League. By the time he actually sold the club, in January 2008, Derby were already doomed. The buyers were a US-based group named General Sports and Entertainment, or GSE for short, who were a consortium made up of 5 businessmen, 3 from the US, 1 from China, and 1 from Korea. They paid around £50 million to acquire the club, but Pearson still stayed on as Derby's de facto chairman in spite of the sale. In the Derby County programme notes for the club's first game following the sale, Pearson wrote that, quote, "The long-term aim is to establish the Derby brand worldwide through successful alliances with sporting teams in the USA, the Far East, and other continents. The immediate aim is to continue to build the infrastructure of the club at Pride Park and develop a squad which, over the coming seasons, is renowned as a Premier League force. The turnaround in the fortunes of Aston Villa with their American investment in squad and club infrastructure is a key model we would like to emulate." End quote. You probably don't need me to tell you that Derby County didn't become an established brand worldwide in the subsequent years, and the relationship between Aston Villa supporters and the club's US owner actually ended up turning pretty sour as well. But that's another story for another time. In reality, Derby didn't win another game all season following the sale, and the next season, the club only finished 8 points above the relegation zone in the Championship. Though, supporters were at least given something to cheer, at long last, as the Rams reached the semi-final of the League Cup, in a run which included a 1-0 win against Manchester United at Pride Park. Derby ended that season under the stewardship of Nigel Clough, Brian Clough's son, and he guided the Rams to 4.5 seasons of relative mid-table obscurity before being replaced by former England boss Steve McClaren. McClaren completely turned Derby's fortunes around, aided by the goals of informed centre-forward Chris Martin, who scored 25 goals as Derby finished third in the Championship, reaching the playoff final where they were beaten 1-0 by Queen's Park Rangers, courtesy of a curving strike in the 90th minute from Bobby Zamora. The following summer, a lifelong Derby fan named Mel Morris acquired a 22% stake in the club for an undisclosed fee. Morris, who was born in Derbyshire, made his initial fortune through an online dating website called UDate, first launched in the US and floated on the Nasdaq, which arrived in the UK at the turn of the millennium. When UDate was sold in 2002 for £91 million, Morris is believed to have pocketed around £20 million of that sum. He subsequently went into the cybersecurity business, where he secured another successful exit, but it was his 2003 investment in the video game developers King that would eventually account for the bulk of Morris's vast personal fortune. King helped to found the business, serving as chairman from 2003 through to 2014, and by the time of his departure, King had shot to fame as a business thanks to the launch of the mobile game Candy Crush Saga in 2012. The Candy Crush series had more than 500 million downloads on mobile devices, becoming one of the most popular and successful mobile games of all time, raking in more than $1 million a day at its peak. When King was acquired by Activision Blizzard in 2016 for a whopping $5.9 billion, Morris collected around £450 million, which accounts for over 80% of his total estimated £515 million net worth. Though Morris hadn't yet received that windfall in 2015, when American Partners LLP put Derby County up for sale, Morris, who was already the club's chairman, chose to expand his 22% stake in his Boyd club and become their sole owner. An estimated net worth of £500-ish million, whilst obviously an enormous amount of money, isn't actually all that much by Championship standards these days. But nonetheless, Morris quickly went on a lavish spending spree, laying out his ambition to establish Derby County in the Premier League and stumping up the necessary funds to realise those aims. He got rid of Steve McLaren, who had taken Derby to the Championship playoff final, and replaced him with Paul Clement, who had previously served as Carlo Ancelotti's assistant at Chelsea, PSG and Real Madrid, but was only just entering first-team management for the first time. In Clement's first summer in charge, Derby spent over £30 million in the transfer market on the likes of Tom Ince, Bradley Johnson and Jacob Butterfield, without making a single penny in player sales. That is an absolute fortune in terms of net spend by Championship standards, even more so 5 or 6 years ago, and Morris didn't stop there. He also brought in former England internationals such as Scott Carson, Stephen Warnock and Darren Bent, all of whom arrived on free transfers but commanded hefty wages. Expectations were high then, but after a poor start, Derby went on a fabulous run from September onwards, looking like promotion contenders all season from that point on. However, over the festive period, Derby's form faltered once again, and at the start of February, with the Rams occupying 5th place in the Championship table, Paul Clement was sacked just 8 months into the job. An 8-game winless run seemed like the most likely, albeit still rather harsh justification, but after sacking Clement, Morris came out and said that promotion, quote, was not the primary target, and that Clement's rapid dismissal was because he hadn't bought into what Morris called the Derby way, claiming that was his priority, not promotion. In comments, the left Derby County fans and the wider footballing community scratching their heads a little and wondering what was in fact the Derby way. Clement was replaced internally by youth team coach Darren Wassell, who had been at Pride Park since 2009 and, therefore presumably, understood the Derby way. Wassell did, in fairness, manage to turn Derby's poor form around, though they still ended the season in 5th, the same position that they had occupied when Clement lost his job, and they were beaten 3-2 on aggregate by Hull City in the season's Championship playoff semi-final. The next few seasons heralded continued spending, a managerial merry-go-round, and a lack of distinct vision or aim that went beyond simply get to the Premier League. Again, in all fairness, Derby did come very close to reaching the Premier League, developing an undesirable reputation as playoff bottle jobs. Darren Wassell went back to his academy management following his failed playoff campaign, only to be replaced by former Leicester City boss Nigel Pearson. Pearson lasted just 9 league games in charge of the club, being suspended by Morris on the morning of a game between Derby and Cardiff City, which heralded only the club's second win of the season, and he was sacked shortly thereafter. According to the Sunday Mirror, Pearson's suspension came after he spotted drones flying above the club's training ground during training sessions, which he discovered Morris was using to watch the club's training sessions from anywhere in the world. Pearson seemingly wasn't too impressed by this, and the subsequent row between the two is said to have seen him lose his job. Just 1 win from his first 9 games of the season, with one of the biggest budgets in the division, probably didn't help either in all fairness. Then came the return of the Mac. That's right, Steve McLaren, though that also only lasted for 5 months. And after McLaren received his P45, it was the turn of former Birmingham City boss Gary Rowett. Just a reminder that this is all in one season. A season in which Derby County ended in 9th place in the Championship table, but Rowett kept his job following a strong finish to the campaign. Not only that, Rowett, who previously spent 3 seasons at Derby during his playing days, stuck around for the entirety of the following season, in which Derby finished 6th in the table, sealing a return to the dreaded playoffs, where the Rams were beaten 2-1 over 2 legs by Fulham in the semi-finals. That was Rowett finished, of course, and Morris next went for a bit of a curveball and a managerial novice in the form of Frank Lampard. Fresh off the back of a 2-year stint as a pundit, following retirement from playing at New York City FC, Lampard was also backed in the transfer market, in addition to using his many contacts to bring in a raft of highly impressive loan arrivals. Despite strengthening the Derby squad significantly, in what was a highly eventful campaign, Lampard was unable to improve upon Gary Rowett's 6th place finish. But he was able to reach the Championship playoff final, beating Leeds United in a dramatic two-legged playoff semi-final. Derby's playoff curse wasn't far behind though, and in the playoff final, the Rams lost 2-1 to a resurgent Aston Villa. That brings us rather nicely to the start of the 2019-20 campaign, which is really when most people in the wider world of football, outside of Derbyshire, began to learn of some of the problems at Derby County, or, at the very least, the extent of those problems. It was during the 2019 off-season that Derby published their accounts for the 2017-18 campaign, posting a record pre-tax profit of £14.6 million. It was the club's first profitable year in more than a decade, quite the feat for a heavy-spending Championship outfit who had failed to realise their dream of promotion to the Premier League. Hurrah! 3 cheers for Derby and for Mel Morris. What a fantastically well-run financial operation. Well, actually, maybe not. Probably best to just pop the glass of toasting champagne to one side for now. You see, Derby's £14.6 million profit would actually have been a £22.6 million loss were it not for the fact that Mel Morris bought Pride Park, Derby County Stadium, off the club for £80 million and then leased it back to the club via a company that Morris himself had set up. If you're wondering where the difference between £14.6 million of profit and negative £22.6 million comes from, essentially, Derby independently valued Pride Park at £41 million, which would show up as an asset on their balance sheet, but when Morris bought the ground for £80 million, £39 million more than Derby had valued it at, that showed up as a £39 million profit in that year's annual accounts. This has become an increasingly common trend within the EFL of owners buying stadiums off the clubs they also own in an effort to bypass or find legal loopholes around the league's FFP regulations. Aston Villa, Sheffield Wednesday and Reading have all engaged in similar practices, though the EFL has now taken steps to remove the loophole and prevent teams from using this strategy in order to overspend in an attempt to unlock the status and untold riches that come with promotion to the Premier League. There was something else that was slightly unusual about Derby County's accounts though, something that you wouldn't find in any of the other 91 Football League teams' accounts, and that was how they accounted for player amortization. Any of you who have watched any of my other sort of finance-orientated videos in the past will be familiar with that term, but for those of you who haven't, and for those of you who aren't, amortization is an accounting term which basically just means gradually writing off the initial cost of an asset, rather than doing so instantly on the date of purchase. So, if a club signs a player for £4 million on a 4-year contract, that typically won't show up as a £4 million expense in the accounts posted for the year in which said player was signed. Instead, that expense will be written off gradually in £1 million instalments in each set of accounts over the next 4 years. That is what 91 clubs in the Football League in England do with their accounts. But what Derby chose to do is to say that when they signed a player for, say, £4 million again, just to give an example, well, they have signed a £4 million asset and they still think that that player is worth £4 million. So, in year 1, they don't see that as a loss at all, just cash that has been exchanged for an asset of equal value. In year 2, well, Derby still think the player is worth £4 million, and therefore there is still no loss. By year 3, and certainly by year 4, if no contract agreement has been arranged, then clearly the player cannot be valued at £4 million, because they will be free to leave the club at the end of the season. But up to that point, Derby don't view signings as outgoings in the same sense as every other club. Derby called this method of accounting expected recoverable values and argued that it was more accurate than valuing assets on a straight line basis. You might be thinking, well, in fairness, there is some sense to that, and it certainly isn't totally illogical. The issue, as far as the EFL is concerned, is that it just so happens that in being able to write off expenses when they first appear, and delaying that 3, 4, or maybe even 5 years, that is very convenient when it comes to passing FFP regulations, something Derby would have found extremely difficult had they not discovered this novel approach to accounting. This has caused quite the furore within the EFL and at the bottom end of the championship, where any points deduction would have seen Derby relegated. The EFL charged Derby with 2 breaches of their regulations, but the club appealed and took the matter to court. Morris and Derby had acted within their legal right to sell the stadium to a company owned by Morris and to lease it back to the club, even though it was a bit of a moral grey area. But the EFL objected to the £80 million valuation, which they believed was obviously obscene in comparison to the true value. The second charge was in relation to Derby's accounting in terms of amortisation. In the first instance, the court decided entirely in Derby's favour, deeming the stadium valuation to have been reasonable, or at least not so unreasonable that it could be brought into question in a court of law. In the second instance, the court was largely sympathetic towards the club, and certainly much more so than the EFL would have liked, handing them little more than a slap on the wrist. The EFL may have anticipated that their stadium findings would be quashed, but they felt the courts had been wholly wrong when it came to the amortisation issue, so they appealed the decision. It took 8 months for the courts to reach another judgment, but in the end, they sided with the EFL on one crucial aspect of Derby's accounting process, which involved an awful lot of legal jargon, but basically, the issue that the EFL had with it, that the courts concurred with, was that it did give Derby an unfair advantage over other teams around them because they were able to reduce their accounted costs and could therefore spend more money. This case only concluded a couple of weeks ago and could well keep rumbling on, since both Derby and the EFL now have the opportunity to appeal the court's judgment once again. The ruling is largely considered to have been favourable to Derby, primarily because it doesn't include any retrospective points deduction. The Rams finished just 1 point above the relegation zone last season, so any retrospective deduction of 2 or more points would see them relegated to League One. This is what the EFL had hoped the outcome would be, and as such, when they announced their fixture list for the season, they did interchangeable Championship and League One fixtures, meaning that Derby and Wycombe Wanderers, who would be spared relegation should Derby not survive, could swap fixtures. The court didn't come to such a draconian ruling though, instead issuing the club with a £100,000 fine, a formal warning, and demanding that they rewrite all of their accounts for the 3 years in which they used their unique amortisation method with a more standard accounting procedure. This opened up a whole new can of worms, since it meant there was a danger Derby would exceed the £39 million of losses a club is able to make within FFP regulations over a 3-year period, since their novel accounting had been brought in to avoid that threat. However, Derby are now suggesting that they have received a £30 million windfall within their accounts on the grounds that the £80 million that they sold the stadium for should never have been put down as a £39 million profit, which was just the value of the sale above what the club had independently valued the stadium at from 2008 onwards, and that £80 million should instead be compared to what the stadium actually cost the club, which was apparently more like £10 million, and that they had, therefore, an extra £30 million of profit to add to those accounts over those 3 years. If that were the case, and the EFL were to accept that claim, Derby would have no trouble passing FFP requirements with their updated accounts, though it seems likely the club would still pass, even without that extra £30 million. The EFL's insistence on repeatedly appealing judgments made in the club's favour, seeking of the harshest possible outcomes and in issuing a number of embargoes on Derby, has been seen by some as a little obsessive and vindictive, as if they are out to get Derby in some respect. The EFL would justify their relentlessness on the grounds that a number of EFL clubs have ended up facing serious financial hardship in recent years and have even gone to the wall, meaning that they have to tighten up and properly enforce their rules and regulations. EFL clubs have also repeatedly lobbied the EFL to be stricter with these policies, so the EFL would claim that they are following the wishes of their members and acting in their best interests. The biggest plus point for Derby is the news that the club will almost certainly compete in the Championship next season. A £100,000 fine is a blow at a time when the club is in a real financial mess, but it is child's play in comparison to the blow and the loss of income that comes with being relegated from the Championship to League One. It also makes Derby County a much more attractive and saleable asset, given that the club has now been up for sale for 2 years. There have been 2 very high-profile takeover bids, or supposed takeover bids, at Pride Park in the last 12 months, both of which have had some quirks and confusion surrounding them. The first involved a man named Khalid bin Sultan bin Zayed Al Nahyan, better known simply as Sheikh Khalid, and his UK holding company, Deventio Holdings Limited, in a deal said to be worth £60 million. Sheikh Khaled has previously been in talks to buy both Newcastle United and Liverpool, with Newcastle owner Mike Ashley having expressed doubts surrounding the extent of the Sheikh's personal wealth. Sheikh Khaled is the cousin of Manchester City owner Sheikh Mansour, who certainly has no lack of cash knocking about. But Sheikh Khaled's reported attempts to raise external funding has caused some to question how much money he individually has. Nonetheless, it was announced last season that a deal had been agreed between the 2 parties and was simply pending the approval from the EFL's Fit and Proper Persons test. Derby was so sure that the deal would be completed that Sheikh Khaled actually had a say, supposedly, in Wayne Rooney's appointment and Derby's dealings during the winter transfer window. And then, well, things just sort of fizzled out in March, apparently ending when the Sheikh failed to meet a payment deadline and the deal was off. The next man to enter the fray was even more mysterious. A certain Eric Alonso, the same man who I said I could make an entire video about in the introduction. I shall have to tread lightly here because just about everything that has ever been said about Alonso, he disputes, and just about everything he says about himself, someone else has also disputed. Alonso was certainly born in Spain, he is certainly, or was certainly, 29 years old, and he has had 5 bouts as a professional boxer, and he lives, or has lived, in Indonesia at some point. Other allegations about Alonso include that he has stood for office as a member of Spain's far-right Vox party, an allegation which Alonso denies, despite his name and likeness having been used by Vox, along with the fact that he has liked some of the party's posts on social media. Alonso doesn't deny liking some of their social media posts, but he says he follows politicians and parties of all stripes, not just the far-right ones. The fact that Alonso's takeover bid eventually fell through, again seemingly down to issues when it came to securing funding or proof of funding, is probably both good news and rather unsurprising news from Derby County fans' perspective. Supporters may be keen to move on from the Mel Morris era and try to put some of this uncertainty behind them, but Alonso would appear to be a very shady character, who could well have made the situation even worse. To understand the extent of Derby's financial mismanagement, it's worth pointing out the fact that Mel Morris is said to have invested roughly £200 million of his own money into the club, and then to look at where they have gone during that time. He first acquired a 22% stake in the Rams after a season in which they reached the Championship playoff final. Last season, they narrowly avoided relegation, and have been embroiled in costly legal battles with the EFL for some time. That is another point that must be made, by the way. Both Derby and the EFL are likely to have spent millions of pounds on legal fees alone in this case, and those costs will keep on climbing if this case goes on any longer. When Mel Morris arrived at Pride Park, there was a suggestion that he was going to bring a tech-orientated, data-driven, highly analytical approach to the club, given his background in the tech space and development. That couldn't have been further from the truth. What Morris has actually done is, well, just throw money at things. And when that hasn't worked, he's thrown some more money at it and then bought the stadium so that he hasn't got in any trouble for all the money that he keeps throwing at the club without achieving promotion. It would be unfair not to acknowledge the fact that Derby have come close to reaching the Premier League under Morris on numerous occasions, and that what he has done is not unusual in the Championship. But when you bet the house on red, or when you bet the stadium on reaching the Premier League, which would be a more accurate analogy in this instance, and it comes out black, or it comes out with playoff heartbreak, you're left with a mound of debt, not a great deal of revenue, and football's governing bodies chasing after you for trying to avoid their financial restraints. Players went unpaid at times last season, at Pride Park. The average wage at the club has gone from less than £6,000 a week in 2013 to £22,000 a week now. Derby spend almost 150% of their total turnover on their wage bill alone. Factor in the vast sums paid out to the many managers sacked by Mel Morris, who has chosen to take a hands-on approach rather than entrusting a director of football when it comes to his managerial appointments, along with the fees racked up by their many court cases, both with the EFL and a £2 million payout to Richard Keogh after Derby sacked their club captain, and it is easy to see why the club's situation is so perilous. Events off the pitch continue to overshadow those on it, and of course, they will have a huge say on what happens at the club next season. Wayne Rooney kept his job last season, partly because everyone was aware that he was operating under testing circumstances, but most likely primarily because Derby were well aware that they couldn't afford to sack him and cough up what would have been an enormous severance package. For Rooney, his first job has not proved to be the walk in the park that it was for Frank Lampard, in the sense that Lampard was given money to spend, some very good loan signings, and the threats to the club during that time weren't quite so existential. He became the club's first-team boss following Philip Cocu's dismissal, though many have speculated that Morris signed Rooney as a player-coach with the intention of giving him the top job as Cocu's replacement at some stage, which would rather undermine Cocu's authority were that the case. Rooney is a very inexperienced manager, in a job which now requires seriously astute managerial credentials and excellent man management. One thing is for sure, Rooney clearly loves football and has a real appetite to make it in management. Otherwise, he wouldn't still be there. The Manchester United and England legend has earned enough money for 50 lifetimes, so at this stage, football is purely a passion project. And I am reliably informed that he is incredibly passionate and hungry to develop and learn as a coach. Derby don't really have time for anyone to learn on the job though. As things stand, there are only 8 players at the club who are over the age of 21. Derby is strengthened by a strong academy which has provided them with some very capable championship players who will boost that squad. But there is no doubt that this is a paper-thin squad even with that assistance. Derby County are in desperate need of new ownership, new direction, new players, an end to the courtroom battles and fighting with the EFL, and the chance for supporters to once again be able to go to a game, grab a burger or a pie, and concentrate on the football, rather than having to read up on what amortization or FRS 102 standard accounting is until they are blue in the face and wondering what on earth is going on. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the situation at Derby County or only knew it in part, hopefully this video has been of some assistance. I am well aware that it is probably the longest one of these that I've ever made, though there is still a great deal of information that I had to leave out, either because I thought it was a bit tedious and wordy, or because it would open up a whole new can of worms and I'd be gone for another 10 minutes. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I love making these types of videos, I just wish that they didn't take me quite so long to make. I have a list of 5 or 6 clubs that will be perfect for this series that I need to start researching and getting on with as soon as possible, but if there are any others that you'd like to see added to that list, feel free to let me know about them in the comments, and I'll see what I can do. Thank you all as ever for watching, hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section, and make sure to turn on subscriptions and notifications and all that stuff by hitting the little notifications bell for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram or both by the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.